line is, "Violence is a cleansing force." 6 words of Frantz Fanon's, quoted for 60 years to prove he preached it. And I almost always meet those 6 words on their own, cut loose from the chapter they came from. So before we judge the line, start where the chapter starts, not with a slogan, with a definition, and a blunt one. In the first chapter of The Wretched of the Earth, in Richard Philcox's translation, Fanon writes, quote, "Decolonization cannot be accomplished by the wave of a magic wand, a natural cataclysm, or a gentleman's agreement," end quote. In plain terms, it is not a gift, and it is not a deal signed across a table. He calls it the total substitution of one order for another. And he says it is violent from the first day, because the order it replaces was violent from the first day. Now, there are 2 shortcuts I catch myself reaching for about the end of empire, and they prop each other up. The first says the colonies were simply handed their freedom. The second says Fanon was just the prophet who told the colonized to kill. If you believe the first, the second writes itself, because anyone who says freedom had to be taken by force must be a fanatic. But those are things I hear said about Fanon. They are not arguments he makes. And it's easy to keep a thinker's most alarming line and quietly drop the rest. So let's not. What did Fanon actually argue about violence and decolonization? First, the world he describes. Then, that sentence, set against one serious critic. And last, the thing he says the whole upheaval is for. Soon after the definition, Fanon turns to a map. Fanon writes, quote, "The colonial world is a compartmentalized world," end quote. Compartmentalized just means sorted into parts that don't touch. And he means it almost literally. The colonized world, he says, is a world divided in 2. And the line between the halves is drawn by the army barracks and the police station. On one side, the settler's town, stone and steel, its trash cans overflowing with leftovers. On the other, the quarter he calls the native town, hungry and crowded. Think of 2020, when crowds in a dozen countries pulled colonial statues off their pedestals. And for a week, the argument about who built the world was standing in the town square. Fanon's version is older and colder. The division was not only in the monuments, it was in the map of the town and in the verdict the colony passed on who counted as a person. Because here, Fanon says something sharper than geography. The colony does not only fence the colonized into the smaller half, it tells them what they are. Fanon calls that world Manichaean, which is his word for a world split into pure good and pure evil. He says the colonists cast the colonized as the essence of evil, a people declared beyond ethics, the enemy of every value, and speaks of them in zoological terms as animals. So the title of the book stops being abstract. The wretched of the earth are the people an entire order has declared damned and less than human. So when Fanon puts armed force at the center of what holds this world together, the bayonet, the cannon, the rifle butt, he is describing a system that runs on 2 things at once: physical force and a daily verdict about who is human. Here is where I have to be careful, because it would be easy to make Fanon sound gentler than he is. He is not only diagnosing the colonizers' violence, he writes that the 2 sides face each other with no shared ground possible, and that one of them, in his words, is superfluous. Fanon frames colonial power as a thing that speaks through force, and I read his account of the answering violence as a reply to it. And I notice how much that word, reply, wants to excuse everything that comes after it. So hold it loosely. So now the 6 words from the top. with the chapter around them. Fanon writes, quote, "At the individual level, violence is a cleansing force. It rids the colonized of their inferiority complex, of their passive and despairing attitude." End quote. Here is my honest trouble with it. I keep wanting to make this merely strategic, to have Fanon saying only that violence is politically useful, because that version is easy to defend. Then he says cleansing at the individual level, and the strategic reading falls apart in my hands. He means something inside the person. Remember the verdict from a moment ago, that the colonized has been declared subhuman, an animal, absolute evil. Fanon's claim is that violence rids that person of the smallness and the despair the verdict left behind. I read that as a claim about what happens in the mind when the condemned stop accepting the condemnation. And I will tell you now, before we go on, that the same book is going to make that word, cleansing, very hard to keep. But take the claim at full strength first. Here, a serious reader pushes back. Hannah Arendt, in her 1970 book On Violence, 9 years after The Wretched of the Earth was published, argued that Fanon's readers and the preface Sartre wrote for the book, which is not Fanon's own text, glorified violence beyond what she took to be Fanon's more doubtful pages. Sit with that, because I don't want to resolve it too fast. Fanon is making a real claim about dignity reclaimed, and my own worry, sharpened by Arendt, is what happens when you dress violence up as a cure. Underneath the two of them runs a point about direction, about who started this. The colonized, in Fanon's reading, did not invent this grammar of force. He writes that the colonizer's own agent uses, quote, "a language of pure violence," end quote, and brings it into the home. And when Fanon names the shape of the whole thing, he uses an old phrase. Fanon writes, quote, "the last shall be first," end quote. Decolonization for him is not the colonized being let into the settlers' world as equals. It is a reversal. The bottom becomes the top, and the world built to keep them apart is not reformed. It is replaced. You can feel the caricature getting ready to win here. Fanon, the man with one sentence, who prescribed violence the way a doctor writes a script, and everything else, a footnote. But he tells you what the upheaval is for in that same opening chapter, right beside the claim that it is violent. Fanon writes, quote, "Decolonization is truly the creation of new men," end quote. The aim, as I read it, is a different kind of person, no longer what the colony made him, no longer the animal in the verdict. And that does not let Fanon off the hook. It tightens the screws on him. Wanting to make a new person is not proof that the violence heals anyone, not the one who strikes and not the one who lives through it. If anything, naming a transformative end raises the bar for a word like cleansing. It does not lower it. And this is the promise I said would come due. In the 5th chapter, titled Colonial War and Mental Disorders, Fanon presents case files. They document psychiatric harm across the colonial war, among colonized patients caught in it, and among the French perpetrators and agents caught up in it too. I do not read those cases as Fanon taking the cleansing claim back, and I am not going to treat them that way. But I do read them as pressure on it. They open a gap between a political reversal and a healing of the mind that the cleansing sentence seems at first to promise closed, which is why neither shortcut survives contact with the book. Fanon is not the safe humanist who never really meant the violence, and he is not the apostle who meant only that. In that first chapter, he gives anti-colonial violence a claimed political and psychological purpose. A few chapters on, as a psychiatrist, he sets down its cost in the same book. So let's come back to the 6 words we started with. I read Fanon as presenting decolonization not as a gift of inclusion, but as a total substitution, one order for another, and the colonized violence as an answer to a colonial order that was already violence and already a verdict on who was human. The cleansing line is a psychological claim inside that argument about a self the colony called damned reclaimed. That much is on the page. The next part is my judgment, not a summary. Explaining where a violence comes from does not prove it is justified, and calling it a restoration of the self does not show that it heals rather than scars. A serious reader can grant Fanon the first, that colonial rule was violence, and still refuse the second, that the answer to it cleanses. That is the fault line, and it runs straight through those 6 words. If Fanon is right, the violence that ends a colony asks to be weighed differently from the violence that built it. If Arendt is right, then, and this is my way of carrying her worry, calling any violence cleansing is a promise that outlives its use and comes back to wound the people who believed it. I lean toward Fanon on the diagnosis and toward Arendt on the promise, and I would rather stand in that split than pretend the book closes it. Read the chapter whole before you decide, and notice, while you do, who gets to call which violence order, which violence disorder, and who gets called an animal in the first place.